Hey everyone, today we're going to look at a shorter video on how to create a simple camera animation inside of Blender. I'll give you some tips and tricks that should hopefully help you get on the way with camera animation in Blender, and then exporting it from Blender and then importing it into Marmoset Toolbag. The version of Blender that we'll be working with today is version 2.91, and the version of Toolbag is version 4.02, I believe. Both of these are the stable, up-to-date versions that are available to us as of the recording of this video. Now, because we're going to be working with animation, let's open a timeline. Let's do that really quickly, and then let's spawn a camera. And I'm just going to set some of these camera settings here. The rotation in the x-axis should be a 0, and then the z and y should be, x-axis should be 90, and z and y should be 0, just so that it's facing forward. I'm going to collapse that down. I'm going to move the camera back and then just kind of square it up with the face. Somewhere around there should be okay. And let's imagine that we want to get a turntable around this character. This is my default Unreal Engine mannequin guy from Mr. Mannequin, which is a great add-on I highly recommend for those of you who work with Unreal Engine. I use him for character stuff and also for scale reference and scenes and assets that I'm creating to bring into Unreal Engine later on. That's created by Jim Croovy, by the way. Big shout out to Jim Croovy. Excellent add-ons and tools for Blender and Unreal. Anyhow, this is my character. Let's assume that we want to spin around the character here and create a seamless turntable animation. Now, for those of you who are going to go ahead and tell me I already know, yes, I know that you can create very simply a turntable animation inside of Toolbag. So you don't have to remind me in the comments, I already know. But if you do have questions or comments, do leave them in the comment section. I know that you can create the turntable over there in Toolbag. I'm just going to show you how to create it here inside of Blender because maybe you don't know how to do that. And I know that there are add-ons that can do it for you, but let's look at a simple way of doing this. And then maybe at the end of the video, I might show you a couple of other camera tricks just to get you up and going on your way. So anyways, now that we have our camera set up, let's make sure I set the output settings because we need our output settings to be consistent between Blender and Marmoset. I happen to know that the frame rate in Marmoset by default is set to 30 FPS, and then in Blender it's 24. So let's make sure we're working in 30 FPS. You can actually change it to whatever you want. Just make sure it's consistent between Blender and Toolbag. And then I happen to know I want 360 frames of animation. So I'm going to type in 361 here inside of Blender. And the reason being is because I've noticed that at random times, it seems that Toolbag will chop off the last frame of my camera's animation. And so I'm going to trick it by giving it 361 frames. That way, if it does chop it off, I still get the full 360 frames of animation. Just a little precaution there. So let's open up our timeline here, and since we're happy with that, I'm actually going to hop down to the Object Properties tab here, and I'm going to, instead of animating this camera manually around the character, that would be a pain. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little trick that I feel like a lot of people use but don't really talk about for some reason. So here we're going to add in an empty, and we're going to use plain axes. You can use any other one of these, but I prefer plain axes. And that's going to be spawned in at the center of the world because I haven't moved my 3D cursor. If yours has been moved, then just zero out your location. And that's also why I opened up the object properties here. You'll find them in both places. But just make sure that it's zeroed out so that this is at the center of the world. Essentially, make sure that it's at the origin of whatever it is you want to spin around. So for example, if this is here, move back one, make sure that this is also in the same place as the center of it. Otherwise, you're going to get some strange rotation. That takes a little bit of consideration, but the more you do this, the more you'll understand. But because I know ours is all set up at the 0, 0 coordinate, this is fine. Anyways, so now we need to create a relationship between our camera, which will be the child, and our parent, which is the empty here. So what we do is we select the camera and then we shift select the empty and press Control P inside the viewport and say set parent to object. And you'll notice that this relationship line has appeared between our child and our parent. If for some reason you don't have that, open up your viewport overlay settings and make sure that your relationship lines option is ticked on. Otherwise that will disappear. So make sure that that's on. And now any transformations that we do to our empty will also happen to our camera, which is exactly what we want. So at frame 1, with our empty selected in the 3D viewport, I'm going to press I and say location, rotation, and scale. You could just simply press rotation and that would work perfectly fine. I prefer to use all three of these because I often move things and scale them, and I want to make sure all that frame data gets stored in the keyframe. Then we're going to move to the last frame by pressing this button that jumps us to the endpoint here, and I'm going to, with the empty selected, press the R key, then press the Z key, and then type 360, so it gets a full 360-degree rotation. You can see that over here in the object properties, and then of course in the viewport I'm going to press I and say location, rotation, and scale. And now we have a perfectly seamless, well, it will be perfectly seamless, but a nearly perfectly seamless rotation of our camera all the way around our character. There is, however, one thing to note, that our animation ramps up and ramps down, and that may or may not be what we want. If it is something that you want, then leave it. If it's not something that we want, there is something we can do to make this a constant rotation around the character. So with both of these keyframes selected in the timeline, I'm going to right click any one of them, and I'm going to say interpolation mode, and we're going to switch it from Bezier to linear. Now before I do that, let me show you how to know which one you're actually in, because there's no real indicator here. Now, by default, it sets it to Bezier. So if I open up a new window here, a new editor, and go to the graph editor with my camera selected, or sorry, with my empty selected, you can see here empty, we can actually see that there is some animation here. We need to go view and say frame all, which is also the home key on the keyboard. And you can see here that our 2 frames of animation, there's one here and one here, and this goes between 0 and 360. And this is blue because it's the Z-axis, which in my theme happens to be colored blue. For you, it might be a little slightly different color of blue, or something entirely different if you have a different theme. But essentially what's happening here is we're animating between the 0 point and the 360 point, and we have some easing that's going on in our timeline here. And so our keyframes are starting to, they kind of start slow and they speed up, and then they slow down. And you can see that with these Bezier handles. And so that's how we can kind of indicate to ourselves that we are actually using a Bezier interpolation. Now to switch that, again, hover over your keyframe and right click and say interpolation mode linear. And you see we lose those handles and we just have a perfectly linear line here that allows our camera to constantly rotate around the character. Now in order to make this a perfectly seamless animation, if I'm staying in Blender, I just need to switch my end frame to 360 instead of 361. And the reason for that is because our frame 1 and our frame 361 are the exact same frame, because a 0 rotation on the Z-axis is the same thing, the same location in 3D space as a 360-degree rotation in the Z-axis. And so we don't need 2 frames of that same, those 2 same frames. We want to chop one of those off so that it seamlessly continues to rotate. And if I zoom in here, you can see that as we come to the end here, it does actually seamlessly loop. And so if for you, if that's all you wanted, wanted to know how to create seamless loops inside of Blender, there you go. I'm actually going to close off this graph editor and I'm going to move out. Now you may be saying to yourself, great, now all I have to do is grab my camera and my mesh and I'll just export it and bring it into Marmoset. Wrong. That's not how that works. So the reason for this is because we created 2 keyframes, which is, it's a great simple trick, but they're on the empty. How do we translate all of that motion, all of that frame data onto the camera? Because if we do this right now, we might get this camera here, but it's just going to be staring at our mannequin. It won't actually be animating inside a Toolbag. So the way that we do that is we select our camera and we go to Object and say Animation, Bake Action. And now what's going to happen is we'll see our frame ranges and our frame step. Leave that all default for now. And actually, let me undo this. Let me make sure that I add that one extra frame there because I want that extra frame for a Toolbag. So again, I'm going to click this and say Animation, Bake Action, and there we go. So we get 1 to 361 at a frame step of 1. We're going to say only selected bones, which is fine, even though we don't actually have any rigged bones or skeletons or anything like that in the viewport or in the project. And I'm going to say clear parents and overwrite current action. Now this clear parent, if you hover over it, it says bake animation onto the object and clear parents. So it's going to take any animation data that's stored in the parent, it's going to transfer it up to our camera. That way we don't need the empty anymore. And then we're also going to override our current action because we want it to be the current one. Now if you have multiple actions, make sure that you're on the current action or you create a new one, that way you don't override any old ones. We also have bake data here. We're not using any posable skeletons or rigs like I mentioned before, so we're not going to use that one. We're simply going to use object and say OK. And now you'll see that the relationship line has disappeared. Our empty is still there. It still has the 2 frames of animation. It's still going to rotate. But if I delete this now, let's delete that there, you can see that our camera still moves the way that it's expected. And if I click on it, you can see we have all the frames that were created by baking that action onto the camera. Now, if I select everything in my scene, doesn't really matter which order, but I do prefer to select the mesh last just as a personal thing. You can also just select nothing. It really depends on what you want to export out of Blender. Let's say you have a whole scene behind this. Make sure that you're controlling what you have selected so that you don't get any extra stuff that you don't want to export. Anyways, with the object selected, I'm going to say File, Export, and then find FBX. So we have to use an FBX instead of an OBJ because FBX can actually carry camera data. And then I'm going to find where I want to store this. So let's store that there. And we're just going to call this Toolbag. Sorry, camera. My microphone's in front of my keyboard. It's a little hard to see. Anyways, so now that we've done that, I want to turn on select objects. Obviously, if you've got more objects or you want to do the whole scene, then of course do whatever is appropriate for you. You can also limit it to the active collection. So if you're working with collections inside of Blender, which I recommend, then make sure you use your active collection. Object types, I'm going to leave it by default, but obviously you're going to want camera and mesh turned on. Otherwise, you're not going to get your camera into Toolbag. The rest of these settings can be left default. Watch out for that apply transform because sometimes it gives me really weird scales inside of Marmoset. But other than that, we can just leave this all the same. Just make sure you have these settings turned on. Do whatever is appropriate to you, and then say Export FBX. Now what we can do is open up Toolbag. Just give that a second to pop open there. And we want to find the Import Model button. So we're going to find that, and then we're going to navigate to our model. So Toolbag Camera. And say open, and you can see here we have our mannequin and our camera. And if we switch from main camera under cameras to camera, you see there we are. And then make sure we change our frame range to 360 and then hit play, and you'll see there we go. We have our whole animated camera that has been switched over from Blender into Marmoset Toolbag 4. So if that's what you were looking for, then I hope that this has been helpful to you. If you have found it helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you would leave a like and subscribe. It helps out the channel. It makes it so I can keep doing this sort of stuff for people. And then share it with people that you think would benefit from it. Now that said, allow me to switch back over to Blender where I have a new file open, and I'm going to show you some slightly more intermediate techniques for getting perhaps a more dynamic camera animation going. So I have my timeline, I've set up my basic settings. I'm going to add in a new camera. We're going to set this to 90 in the X, 00 in the Z and Y, and just move this back and move this up a little bit. And that looks about right. Okay, so let me talk about multiple camera scenes. So for example, if we have more than one camera in our Blender scene, if I just duplicate this one out, when I go to hit 0, it's only going to go to the active camera. It's not going to switch to the other camera. And you can see that here because the other camera is still kind of floating up over there. Now, the way that we can tell which camera is active is this darkened triangle at the top of this one camera indicates to us that this is the active camera and then this camera is inactive. The way that we switch this is we select the camera we want to switch to and say View, Cameras, and then say Set Active Object as Camera or Control Number Pad 0, and that'll switch. Now, we want to use this one, but I just wanted to make sure that if you're following along from the previous part of the tutorial, that if you just create a new camera to do this, just keep in mind that there's going to be a sort of a discrepancy between these two. You got to switch which one you want to be the active camera if you created a new camera from the other one that we made previously. Okay, so now that we've got that sorted, let's hit 0. This looks like a good place. With the camera selected, I'm going to press I and say location, rotation, and scale. And I'm going to show you a really cool trick. So if I hit N and go into my view menu, I can actually say camera to view. So that's going to lock my view to the camera and the camera to my view. So anytime I move the camera now, my view is going to come with it. And so the camera will have keyframes for that. I'm getting a little tongue twisted right now. I should probably take a break, but essentially what will happen here is, let me show you. If I switch over to say 80 frames, or maybe 40 frames into the animation, and I turn on this option here, auto keying, and I move my camera, you'll see now that the camera will go with my view, and it'll kind of allow me to determine where I want to frame things. So let's say right around here. And then with this auto keying on, you'll see it creates keyframes for me so I don't have to keep pressing I, which is handy. So now I can kind of set keyframes. So let's go on to frame 60. And let's say we're going to get close in on these fingers down here. Say we want a close-up shot here. Maybe rotate the camera a little bit. And there we can kind of control how this works. Maybe in the in-between, I want to keep the same zooming, but leave those fingers in view. That way we can have more control over. So here I don't really like this kind of turning motion, so I'm going to take this frame and delete it. And that's just me being nitpicky. And then down here, I want to move this over, maybe zoom this out. That way we have more of a view of what's actually happening and where we're going. And then same thing over here. So let's get rid of this and we'll go in between these two and then frame this up. Maybe zoom it out a little bit more. Something like that. So this is doing some weird stuff now. I'm not sure why. Let's reframe this. And then here, sometimes it can lack the, it can fail to overwrite properly. So that's not too bad. There is a little bit of zoom out that I kind of want to have here. So maybe we'll zoom out a little bit for that frame. There we go. That's looking better. And we'll go tighten on those fingers. Maybe move a little over. And then same thing on the back here. And then at frame 120, we'll just zoom out a little bit. This. And then 160, we'll go over here. Maybe right our camera a little bit. And then 200, we'll go over this side and we'll rotate it a little more. Maybe go from a lower angle. And then 240, we'll swing down this. And then 280. Start coming back up on this side. Really exaggerate that motion. Move this here, maybe zoom in a little bit. And then at around 320, we want to zoom in towards the face. Maybe rotate this back, and then at 360, or 361, we'll get a full headshot like this, and we'll kind of straighten that out. Maybe in a little tighter. There we go. So let's preview this animation. I know it's kind of rough as it is. So that goes in a little bit fast there. I might have to spread those keyframes out. And then we have a little overshooting here where we're kind of losing the character. So let's go like that. Add in that extra keyframe. So here we're going bam. So let's move this keyframe back to 20. Let's see if we can get a little more easing going in. Or what we can do is we can get rid of this keyframe like that. Okay, let's keep that one. But instead of going straight in, maybe we can get rid of this one. There we go. Now we have a little more soft transition. So let's play that, see how it looks. There we go. All right, I don't care too much for this frame right here. So I'm just looking at the way it moves. This stays relatively framed up the way I want it to. In fact, I could actually just move this over a little bit, just like that. There, we have that. A little bit of goofy rotation going on, that's okay. And then we're coming up here. Here, we're losing our character. So again, let's move that back, get some good composition going on, or decent composition at least. Maybe something like this, and there we go. So then we don't really need this frame here. Except for perhaps, again, framing back up on our character. And then we're kind of snaking up the arm there and onto the face. Cool. Let's give it one more playback. Okay, so there's a little bit of lingering in here that I don't care too much for. I don't think we need this frame here necessarily, so let's delete that one. And then across the back, let's get this rotation going like that. There we go. That's looking a little bit better. So let's give that a playback from this point. The camera's a little bit jerky. We're going to smooth that up a little bit. But so far, it's not too bad. All right. The other thing that we could do to make this really interesting, by the way, is we can go into our camera settings and we can set a focal length here. So if I click this right here, you'll get a focal length of 50 here. And actually, maybe I want a focal length of something lower to get a further out, maybe like a 35 there. And again, because auto keyframing is on, it'll actually change that. So we get something like this. And then right here, we want to add another keyframe, so we'll click that. And then as we zoom in here, maybe we want something like a 50 or even an 80. No, 80 is a little too much. Let's go with a 50. And then that'll create a keyframe there for us. We'll let that go there. And then here, let's say from here, we're going to do another 50. And then we're going to switch out to a 35 right here. Whoops, not 385, but 35. And that'll kind of open that up. So it goes from zoomed in to zoomed out, wide angle. And this right here, let's see. It's a little far over there on this keyframe, so I'm going to move the camera just a little bit, get a little bit better framing there. And then let's go over here. That's fine. Maybe here we want to be a little more zoomed in. So maybe like, I don't know, maybe 55 here. There we go. And then here's this. So maybe here we can do something like an 80 just to get this kind of give us a weird composition. Then here we're going to go up the arm. And then so here, let's put in a keyframe for this. And then we're going to set this to, let's see, do we want a 35? That will kind of give us a weird foreshortening length, I guess. And then we can go back into a 50 up here. So it does some funny depth perception type stuff going on. So let's give that a playback and see what it looks like, see if we're happy with it. Nice, okay. It's a little bit abrupt, and that's okay. Again, we're going to kind of smooth some of this stuff out. All right, there was a little bit of a dip there. We kind of lost the head and dipped down to the leg right around here. So head. So maybe this keyframe we want to move up to the head just to keep the head in frame. So there's a little bit of a dip here. So maybe I'll get rid of this frame here. Ooh, that did something I didn't like. Let's see. So for this one, maybe we'll move it up. See if that helps. That's not too bad. It's a little bit jarring, but it's not too bad. Okay. A little bit jarring, but an interesting animation. Also, you'll notice there I messed that up by scrolling out. So let me just scroll back in. And that's a good example as to when we need to turn off our camera view and turn off our auto keyframing. So there we go. We have a unusual animation that gives us some focal areas on our character, gives us some unusual angling, maybe some strange Dutch angles, and then gives us some foreshortening effects going on with our character. Obviously, this is going to become more prominent if there are background things here and maybe some more detail on the character, but you get the idea. All right, so now that we have all these frames, we could just export these frames if you're happy with them, but I'm not really happy with them. Let's take this to another level. Now, before I show you what I'm about to show you, I'm going to say, make sure you create a separate copy of this file in case you don't like any of these specific keyframes, these main frames. You can change them before you do what I'm going to show you. Once you do this next thing that I show you, it's a destructive process. There's not really a good way to go back, in my opinion, unless someone else knows of a way to go back to it. I'm not aware of it currently, so if there is a way to go back and kind of change that from the sampling that I'm going to show you to do now, someone let me know. Otherwise, make sure you're creating a copy of this so that way if you're unhappy with any of your camera frames, you can go back and change it and then do the sampling. So now that we have all of these frames, we're opening up a graph editor over here. Let's hop into our camera with the 0 key, and now I can zoom in because I don't have my camera locked to the view anymore. You'll see here we have all these frames in this window. I'm going to hit the home key, and you'll see all of these wonderful frames that we've created. With everything selected, I can say key and say sample frames, and that's going to create all the keyframes in between. You'll see here. Now, I do note that the original keys that we had are highlighted in yellow, and then these sort of sampled frames are in blue. I don't actually know if there's a way to delete the sample frames, or like it would be great if there was, but I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe there is that I just don't know about it. Anyways, now that we've done that, we can actually smooth these keyframes. So we can hit smooth keys with Alt-O. And I'm going to do this maybe like 30 times or so. I'm just going to hit it a number of times. Don't overdo this because if you do, it will actually destroy some of the timings that you have because it's smoothing them too much. So don't overdo it. I would say maybe around 30 times would be okay. So now when I hit play, you can see here that we get a much smoother animation. Things aren't jerky. It feels a lot more professional, like the camera is actually on a dolly or some sort of rig, and it's starting to look a little bit better. And that actually, I believe it actually smooths out the field of view. Or the focus length, I mean. And so one thing that you should note is that if you want to export this into Marmoset, I would highly recommend not animating the focus length. Do that inside of Marmoset because the camera export options that we have inside of Blender, I don't think consider the focal length of the camera. It just takes the transformation of it, I believe. So that would be the location, the rotation, and the scale. Just something to keep in mind. But essentially, I've shown you how to now create a very dynamic, I guess, or maybe more interesting camera animation for your characters and how you can kind of set that up manually inside of Blender by creating various specific keyframes that you can kind of smooth out later on after the fact. And just to drive this point home, please do make sure that you save a copy of this before you create these sampled frames. Because if you don't, if let's say I don't like where the camera is at this point, I can't just move the camera now. You know, that's going to give me a problem. So let's say, for example, here, I think this is the x-axis rotation. I can kind of change this. Or here, let me zoom in here so I can get the actual frame we're on. I can kind of change this value here. But you'll notice that it's not going to move all the other frames. So that's kind of a problem. One thing that I can do is I can press O and I can use the kind of proportional editing, but you'll see that it kind of makes the frames a little jaggy. And you can try to smooth those out, but I found that more times than not, it actually creates more problems than it solves. So I'd be really careful about doing that. I would save a copy of this and then use that copy as a backup and then change it in the backup version or the new derivative of that backup, so that way you don't overwrite anything or overcommit to this sampled frame animation. So hopefully that is helpful for you. I'm just going to let this play as I talk and do the outro. Hopefully you found that helpful. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and you subscribe to the channel. Share this with anyone else you might think would find this useful. And as always, you have my gratitude for watching. Please do stay safe out there, and I will catch you in the next video.